Greetings, I'm Glennisha Morgan, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm the digital strategist at DJC, and I have with me Megan Wilson. Megan's pronouns are she, her, and them. Megan is interning this summer in the communications department at DJC. Megan is also a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan and also works as a communications outreach coordinator for the Carson State Project at U of M. We're going to dive into some infographics regarding policing in Metro Detroit. These 10 infographics are the product of a deep dive into police budgets across Metro Detroit, inspired by the work of the Divest Invest campaign and last year's highway robbery report on how Detroit suburbs criminalize Detroiters to fund their department. These infographics reveal police spending trends and compare police budgets with arrest and citation data when possible. The goals of the project are to highlight discrepancies between police funding allocations, community needs, and to evaluate whether the police are in fact keeping communities safe. The numbers show that police eat up more of the city's budget each year, but also spend more of their time punishing minor infractions and criminalizing Black Detroiters than stopping harm in the community. How could all of those millions be reallocated toward what communities really need? And what role can the metro area play in shifting to a more just Detroit? All right, so we're going to start with the city of Dearborn, which is south of Detroit, and I will let Megan take it away.
Thanks, Glennisha, and thank you for that introduction. So in Dearborn, the population is 93,000, almost 94,000. It's not the second largest population of the cities that we looked at, but it is the second largest budget. The total police budget is $47.1 million. One thing that we've noticed is that as the police budget goes up, which it has gone up every year, other community resources have seen their budgets shrink. So in this first graph, I showed the data for 2020 and 2021. And the police budget goes up and the water and sewer budget goes down, and the parks and the public works and the library and housing and downtown development, all of them are going down. And in fact, this is a trend that we started seeing it back in 2007. So in 2007, the Dearborn Police Department made up 25% of the city's general fund. And there were several public pools and libraries, and there was a city health department. But then they instituted this minimum staffing requirement in the police department, and their funding skyrocketed. And now they're up to 35% in 10 years, 35% of the city's general fund. And meanwhile, a lot of these other city services, including the health department, have just closed, and others are still having reductions in their funding. So the next graph just shows that Dearborn spends more per capita on on police than any other city that we looked at. So it spends $501 per capita, which is even more than Detroit, and it's more than any of the other suburbs as well. The third section talks about this expansion of the Dearborn Police Department's share of the city's general fund. So now they take up 35%, and these other departments have had to become self-sustaining or to lose funding. And in 2021, Dearborn Police spent almost $2 million just on weapons and more than $2 million on overtime and holiday pay. So these are some line items that are some of the biggest. And they are telling us a little bit about really how the police are using their money. We don't really have good information about how the police are using their overtime, but a trend that I have seen in a lot of cities is that it's an area where there's easy budget expansion. So they can use up all of their overtime budget. They can go over their overtime budget. And then the next year they ask for more. And they say, oh, well, we went over it, so we need more. And this is a way that police departments can justify increasing their budget every year. And at the same time, then, now Dearborn doesn't have a health department. And they don't have adequate resources to respond to things like flooding, which is an issue this year and could easily be an ongoing issue in the future. And this is a real problem in terms of how the city is using its money to meet its residents' needs or not. And then the next thing that we see is that, in fact, calls for service and especially serious charges are going down. So I want to say here that accountability for Dearborn is the real MVP here, because they FOIA'd for so many documents and they made them publicly available. So we just have a ton of data for Dearborn that we don't have for other cities. And their data shows that only 10% of arrests are conducted for reasons of violence or interpersonal harm. Black people make up 54% of arrests and 48% of citations, and it's been steadily increasing. So in 2010, Black people were still issued disproportionate citations, but it was 27% of the total. And so the fact that that's doubled in just 10 years is astounding. And the Dearborn PD fined Black people almost $10 million in the last 10 years. Yeah.
Wow.
So
That's insane.
yeah, it really is. And so 73% of arrests in Dearborn are in the region that borders Detroit. And they used to call it the Border Crimes Initiative Team. They've renamed it. Nevertheless, they are disproportionately targeting Black people, and they're targeting people for minor stuff. In Dearborn, 62% of citations are for things like brake lights and expired registration, things that are like costs associated with the upkeep of people's vehicles, which is just criminalizing poverty. And the Border Crime Initiative Team, another thing that I say here is that 80% of their arrests are for misdemeanors. Serious crimes are going down, arrest rates are even lower. So if we're looking at like how effective the police are at addressing harm, there were over 200 auto thefts reported in 2020, but less than 50 actually arrested. So they're not really being very effective, and they're spending millions of dollars every year to criminalize and arrest Black Detroiters.
Wow. So now we're going to cover the city of Livonia, which has a population of 93,665 with a total police budget of $26.5 million. All right, Megan.
So the first thing that I'll point out is that the population of Livonia is pretty close to the population of Dearborn, and it's true that they're spending $20 million less. Still, there's a lot of issues with their police budget. So the first graph just shows the total Livonia general fund and shows that 2 out of $3 in Livonia's budget are spent on the police and fire. And of that, the police is the majority. The police is 42% of the total general fund, which is high. It's definitely higher than average. And in 2021, Livonia spent $283 per person on police. The next little bit talks about the particular line items that really stood out. So I guess they're renovating their police department because they're spending over $2.5 million on capital improvements. And they're spending over $2 million on overtime and holiday pay, which we have seen before and we will see it again. What's really interesting here is that these numbers are more than Warren is spending, and Warren has the biggest police budget outside of Detroit that we looked at, and Warren's overall police budget is 84% bigger than Livonia's. And still, Livonia is spending a ton of money on these line items, which always raises some questions for me.
Wow. So what does it look like when we compare arrests that are for violence versus things that aren't?
Yeah, so the question that I put in the graph is, how do the police use the money to keep the community safe? And I think that that's exactly the kind of question that I'm trying to really look at here when we're looking at arrests and we're looking at what are the police spending their time on. So in 2019, Livonia made 4,700 arrests, which is a lot of arrests for a city of its size, but they issued over 30,000 of these minor citations. And that's a really big difference. That's really telling us that they are spending most of their time on policing infractions or disputes between people or suspicious behavior. 60% of the people arrested in Livonia were Black. And Livonia's population is less than 5% Black. So it's just like Dearborn, where we see that Black people are overrepresented like tenfold in the numbers of the arrests. In 2019, Black people are especially overrepresented in property crimes like robbery, larceny, fraud, also driving a stolen vehicle, obstructing justice, as well as warrants and weapons and driving without a license. And then for citations, so I said there were 30,000 of them in 2019. Black people are making up 39% of traffic citations and 44% of all citations, which again is hugely disproportionate to like who's actually in the city. But then when it comes to violence, charges like criminal sexual conduct, assault, stalking, those numbers are a lot more representative of Livonia's population demographics. We don't see huge overrepresentation of Black people in those categories, which indicates to me that Black people aren't like committing more violence here, but they are being more policed. And similarly, so this last graphic is showing just how much more Livonia is spending on police than on actual city services. So Livonia is spending $6 million more on the police than on all of these other departments combined: parks, libraries, public works, even the court, downtown development. And still the police are more. So the big question that I wanted to leave people with for this graphic was, yeah, what else could we be funding with $26.5 million if we're already spending so much less on all of these other, what I think of as essential city services that provide people with a sense of safety and a sense of community, the things that we actually want to be building.
Right. The next city that we are going to cover is the city of Ferndale, which has a population of 20,033 with a total police budget of $7.06 million.
So this is a smaller city, and we wanted to include a representative sample as best we could. So we had cities that were really big and had big police departments, and then some that are smaller. And we tried to include a geographical spread across the metro area. So Ferndale is spending less of its general fund on police than any other city in our sample. It's just under 30% of the general fund. And I'll note here too that Ferndale uses what's called priority-based budgeting, where they have this whole online platform and they divide up all of their expenses by, at least in theory, what is benefiting their community, what the community priorities are. And one thing that we noticed then in this graph is that a lot of the departments do get a little bit more. There's a little bit less for the police and a little bit more for some of these other city services. It's still not where we want it to be, but that was something that I noticed. The next graph shows that it's not really enough. So the police department is still spending 70% more than the next largest department, which is usually the fire department. In this case, it is the fire department. And so a lot of other community resources, while they're getting more here than they are in other cities proportionally, they're still underfunded. And Ferndale is spending $338 per capita on police. So we look at $7 million and we think, oh, that's nothing, but they're actually per person spending more than Livonia.
Wow. So how often are police making arrests for something that's more a mental health call or something we know police aren't really needed for?
That's a really good question and a really hard one to answer. So Ferndale prioritizes its calls from 0 to 9. And I don't have full details on what's included in each category, but according to the transparency dashboard, which they have a transparency dashboard, which is why I have these numbers at all. We're going to see for some of the cities later that I don't even have this for all of them. But according to Ferndale's transparency dashboard, 0 through 2 are going to be your serious situations like violence, robbery, bomb threats, the crime that people think about when they think about what police do. And then 3 to 7 are neighbor disputes, animal control, civil matters. Actually, all of those are category 3. So I'm not totally sure what 4 through 7 are, but I would guess that they are similar. And then, of course, because they're lower priority, they're going to be less immediate, less serious than those category 3 calls. And then at the bottom, categories 8 and 9 are things like lost and found, like abandoned vehicles, found property. And so over the last 3 years, the most common calls in order are priority 9, 6, 8, 4, 5, 3. None of these is in the category where any violence or crime is happening. And then we get the most urgent calls, priority 0, and then priority 1 and 2, the rest of crime, are consistently the lowest. They're much lower than any other category. So we have this skewed idea about what police do when most of their time is spent on stuff like civil complaints and, abandoned vehicles. 8.7% are the high priority calls, and everything else is something that maybe we don't need somebody with a gun to be responding to. One thing that I'd really love to know is how many of these are mental health calls and what priority the mental health calls are placed at. So I just don't have that for Ferndale, but I can tell you that in Dearborn, fully 40% of their calls are asking police to provide human services and city services. And only about 1% of their calls are for a situation where there's active violence. So what if we could reframe safety to focus on the resources that are needed rather than what it looks like is happening here, which is essentially keeping Black and poor people out of the suburbs? That's what it looks like. And before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about use of force. So in 2020, the Ferndale police made 528 arrests, and they had 35 instances of use of force. Livonia, for comparison, made about 10 times as many arrests, a little bit less than 10 times as many arrests, and they had the same number of uses of force. So that means that the Ferndale police are 10 times more likely to be using force than Livonia. And Ferndale, interestingly, they frame uses of force as, on their website, as responses to resistance, which implies that there's justification there. And I wonder if that's like part of it too. Ferndale is really proud that in their police report, they talk about how each and every officer has done implicit bias training, but like studies are showing that the training doesn't have a significant impact on officer behavior. And in some cases, it's exacerbating the existing patterns of discrimination. So we see here, same story again, just like Livonia, just like Dearborn, Ferndale's population is 6% Black, and 60% of the arrests in Ferndale in 2020 were Black. And so once again, Ferndale is policing Black visitors to the city, and mostly for minor stuff.
All right, so our next city is the city of Lawrence, which has a population of 133,943 with a total police budget of $48.9 million. Now, I know that you all who are watching cannot fully see the graphics just yet, but I have had a chance to look at them, and something looks just a little bit different here. And so I wanted to sort of talk about, like, looks like something is missing. So can we talk about, like, what's going on with the city of Warren?
Sure, and it's not just the city of Warren. Really, the first three are the ones that are actually outliers, because Dearborn, Livonia, and Ferndale are the ones that gave me data about their arrest breakdown. And specifically, they showed me arrests by race. And so we could talk about the over-policing of Black people. The rest of these cities don't give me that data. So I don't have arrest breakdowns. I'm not really able to do the kind of analysis that I could do for the first three cities. And I would love to, FOIA all of these departments and get all of that data to really see whether the trends that we have seen consistently in these other cities are borne out across the whole metro area. I wouldn't be surprised. But what we do have is, so first, the public safety budget in Warren is 60%. Again, so what we see with Warren here is that 60% of their general fund is going toward public safety. And I do have a more detailed breakdown. It's 38% is just for the police, and the rest is the fire department. And once again, we see that as the police budget gets bigger and bigger, we're not getting as much of the other stuff. So I made this graphic a little bit simpler because there were so many tiny slivers that I just said, public services are 16%, and that's fine. And general government is 23%. And that's a fairly typical number. I'm not particularly concerned about that. What's interesting is that Warren did a weird thing where it broke down expenditures by type instead of by department. So this means that some expenses that are normally all filed under the police aren't here. So in the next graph, we can see that 38%, as I said, of the general fund is spent on police, but it jumps up to 44% if we include the retirement contributions for those officers. And that's normally just automatically included in the police department budget. So I'm thinking that really we ought to be talking about it like it's 44% because that's using the same criteria as the other cities. Warren is spending more than $350 per person on police, which is, again, higher than average. And, I want people to think about, if you're a resident of the city of Warren, your $358 is, the police department is spending that much money, on behalf of you, on behalf of each person in the city. And are the residents of Warren okay with that? So again, in the next section, we see that Warren has about $2 million for overtime and holiday pay. This is a number that comes up over and over. Warren also has budgeted for 6 new hires. So now they have 222 officers, which is the second highest number of uniformed officers in Metro Detroit. That's outside of Detroit. I'm not counting SPD, the state police, or the county sheriff's offices, because of course those are using larger areas, so they have more officers. But still, Warren has about 1/5 of the population of Detroit, and they have 222 officers, and that's a lot of officers.
That is.
And here too, 7.5% of calls are about serious crime, and the rest are minor infractions, complaints, abandoned vehicles. And so here we see, 3,000 arrests, about the same number of traffic accidents, which I count traffic accidents separately, although sometimes they are also arrests do result from them. But all the police departments that talk about traffic stuff tend to keep it separate. So I thought that would just be easier. And there are over 17,000 traffic citations. And so again, we're seeing, the city's paying them almost $49 million, and they're adding 6 new hires this year. And what are they doing? They're policing traffic, mostly.
Wow. All right, so the next city that we'll cover is Sterling Heights, which has a population of 132,438, with a total police budget of $39.4 million.
Yeah, so right away, their population is about the same size as Warren's, a little bit smaller, and they're spending $10 million less on police, which is significant, but it's still like $40 million. It's not a small amount of money. And so one thing that I really noticed in Sterling Heights is that there's a very clear trend where the police, it's only a little bit, but it takes a slightly bigger chunk of the city budget every single year. And so I look at this and I'm thinking, wow, it's creeping slow and steady. And so it's 32, and then it's 33, and then it's 34% of the budget. And I'm like, well, when is it going to be 50? When is it going to be 100? You know, Sterling Heights is another one where the city budget book doesn't list the line items. So I know that 92% of their budget is going to personnel, but I don't know exactly what that means. We do see in the next section that Sterling Heights is spending $284 per person on police. So less than Warren, but still a lot. And yeah, as I said, more than 1 out of every $3 in the city's general fund are going directly into the police. And are they increasing community safety? Could we spend that money better to increase community safety, to increase community resources? So here again, this one was a little interesting. They've got all these line items for getting new stuff. They've got a lot of tactical stuff, body cams, weapons, armor, radar. And then they've also got almost $900K for new vehicles. I think they're buying a whole bunch of new police cars. And they got 7 new hires. So they're bulking up in a lot of ways. And it's like, is there some kind of increased militia activity in Sterling Heights? Are there, like, what is going on that's justifying this increased militarization? And it doesn't look like it. So we've got, for every 1 arrest that Sterling Heights made in the past 4 years, so this is aggregate data, Sterling Heights is issuing 7.7 traffic citations. One of the reasons I liked to put 4 years together, A, I had the data, which is nice. When I have the data, I want to use it. And B, 2020 is a weird year for a lot of reasons. And so I used 2020 data where I had it. I used 2019 data where I had it because it was a more representative year. But if I can get a longer time frame, that's better for me in terms of getting a more accurate picture and not relying on data from a year that might be kind of weird. So what we see here is that Sterling Heights has fewer arrests per capita than Warren, Livonia, and Dearborn. And so they're making fewer arrests than police with similar budgets, and they're spending even more of their time on stuff like traffic citations. So calls for service are increasing. They're getting more calls than they used to, but the rates of violence are not going up, which means that they're spending more of their time punishing little stuff rather than keeping the community safe. And yet, somehow, their budget is going up and up.
For traffic citations.
Apparently. Some of these places I would love to see more of a breakdown of what are their arrests? What are they spending their overtime on? In a lot of these cases, I'll just say this now. in a lot of these cases, it's not really clear what they're using their overtime on. So both Sterling Heights and Royal Oak, which we'll talk about next, have budgeted for less overtime this year. The reductions, I think, are about 100,000 and 42,000 respectively. Although that's from recall, so it could be wrong. Overtime does seem to be a flexible category where, they get a certain amount, they work to hit that allotted amount, and they go over it, and then they say, oh, next year we need some more.
Wow. So the next city we're going to cover is Royal Oak, which has a population of 59,277 with a total police budget of $21.2 million.
Yeah. So Royal Oak, the budget, $21.2 million. is less than some of the other ones we've talked about. Of course, they're a smaller city again. They're spending 45.8% of their general fund on the police, which is one of the highest that we've seen. It's almost half. It's a ton of their money. And they're spending 48% more on the police than on the next largest department. Again, the fire department. In this case, also the general government category is a big percentage of their funding. For a lot of the cities, I didn't have a general government category because they divided it out instead, which is fine with me. But yeah, again, what's really striking here is that Detroit spends about 1/3, 32% of its general fund on police. And that was a big deal, you know, when we did the DPD graphic last year and talked about how they spend $1 in every $3 on their police. And yet out here in the suburbs, it's even more. Okay, yeah, and $333 per person on police. And right, this didn't fit in the section above, but the police budget has increased every year since 2017-18, which is the fiscal year 2018. And then in 5 years from now, the projected police budget is going to be almost $24 million. So again, like Sterling Heights, it's creeping up. It's a little bit more every year, but crime rates have been going down since 2016.
Interesting.
You know, this is not just 2020. So crime rates have declined, but violation tickets have not. Violation tickets tend to sort of go up and down, but they stay within a relatively narrow range. They have been between 14 and 17,000 tickets a year for a while, since 2011. And so again, we're seeing that they're spending more of their time responding to situations that probably don't need somebody with a gun to be there. And Royal Oak too is one of those places that they didn't give me a really detailed breakdown of what their money is going toward. In fact, Royal Oak and Sterling Heights both, they just give me an overview of the changes from last year. And that's really frustrating because, so I looked at last year's budget and they also gave me the changes from last year. And so I'm like, how far back do I have to go to get a line item? So we'll talk about this more in a little bit, because there are some communities that are really standouts in the category of lack of transparency. But this is not just a problem in East Point. This is a problem in a lot of communities where they're not telling us the things that we actually need to know in order to understand what's happening with what the police are getting their money for and then what they're using it on. So in Royal Oak, what I did find was it was about a 5-to-1 ratio of tickets for arrests. And then interestingly, they did have a breakdown of arrests by charge. So I got to see that, again, setting aside traffic accidents, the most common criminal charge is disorderly conduct, which I have seen some disorderly people. These are not situations necessarily where we really need to be calling in the guns, where we need to be spending $21 million funding a police department to take care of this. This is something that we could have a community response to. And we have this idea that the police are protecting our community, but when they're actually spending their time punishing minor infractions, 5 traffic tickets for every 1 traffic accident, they're not really protecting the community.
Not at all. The next city we're going to talk about is Grosse Pointe, which has a total population of 40,650, with a total public safety budget of $25.4 million.
So the Grosse Points are weird and difficult because there's 5 of them. And not all of them have the same information posted. So there's a lot of figuring out where things are categorized for each city and then putting it together to be able to talk about the big picture and trying to collate this information so that it's consistent. As a whole, if we look at the gross points as a unit, the total public safety budget, as you mentioned, is over 25 million, and it's 45% of their combined general fund money, which is, again, a lot of money. And then I broke it down by municipality. So in Grosse Pointe City, it's $3 million, 55%. In Grosse Pointe Farms, it's $5 million, which is 33%. That's the lowest percentage. In Grosse Pointe Park, it's about 7 million, 7.5, and then 65, 66%. That's two-thirds of the general fund in Grosse Pointe Park, which is the biggest, is going toward public safety. And then 3 million for Grosse Pointe Shores and 6.5 for Grosse Pointe Woods. This is all for 2021. In fact, 2021 was the only year for which I had the data for all 5. Some of them had more updated data for 2022, but not all of them. And then some of them did not have data on their websites for past years. So this was what I had to work with. All of the Grosse Pointes have consolidated public safety departments, which means that the police and fire are together. So some of them will still separate out expenses for police and versus fire, but the overwhelming majority goes to police. And the way that it works is that it's the same officers who are cross-trained to respond to both police and fire situations. And so they're just officers, and those salaries are police salaries. They are police officers. And then whatever extra expenses they incur with firefighting goes under fire. I did want to, if you could scroll back up to the first section of that, I just wanted to emphasize that in Grosse Pointe Farms, they're the richest of the 5 Grosse Pointes. They have a median household income of $132,000. Their median home value is $300,000. And yet they're spending only 33% of their general fund on the police, on public safety. Which is really interesting when some of these other places are hitting almost 70% of their city budgets for public safety. And again, the majority of that public safety, although it does include fire, is for the police. And it doesn't quite track with, it's not equivalent to the bigger cities that have separate police and fire departments. In the sense that in a lot of those places, it's like 2/3 police and 1/3 fire. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio in a lot of places. That's not really what we see here because it's the same people doing both jobs. And then the last section down there. Oh, right. So the 5 Grosse Pointes, they do have this mutual aid agreement so that they can support each other's emergencies. And I have seen some articles recently about like questioning how well that works, but that is outside the scope of my research, really, because when you're dealing with consolidated departments, there's about 50 other communities in Michigan that also have these consolidated departments, and often it's more efficient for small communities. And anyway, I will leave that aside. But there was an incident recently that I want to talk about, which is in February 2021. There was an incident of anti-Black intimidation. Somebody was flying a KKK flag like next to their neighbor's house who was Black in Grosse Pointe Park. And the NAACP of the Grosse Pointes and Harper Woods responded to this incident by calling for more women and Black people on the force. They want a more diverse police force. And we've heard this before. We've heard this since the 60s. You know, the NAACP has been saying the same thing since the 60s about getting more Black people in Detroit to apply for the police department too. But the research shows that a more diverse police force is not actually reducing bias among police officers. It's not reducing incidents of misconduct. So perhaps that's when we're talking about, you know, anti-Black intimidation in a place where somebody lives, maybe we ought to be talking more about the systemic racism in the area rather than trying to just get more of the few Black people who live in Grosse Pointe Park. I think it's 8% actually, so it's more than the other Grosse Pointes, but still not a lot of Black people to be on this police force. in the first place. And I don't think that that's going to be a viable solution for these kind of incidents anyway.
The next city we have is East Point, which has a population of 32,081 with a total police budget of $11.6 million.
Oh, East Point. Okay, so this one was probably the most frustrating for me. And before I really get into it, I also want to highlight the highway robbery report that DJC released last year, which has especially data from East Point as well as other places, but really talking about how these places are criminalizing Black Detroiters and they're extracting a whole bunch of money out of them, which then is being funneled into funding their police departments and other parts of their city government. And it's really a deeply exploitative relationship between Detroit and the suburbs. And I just want to encourage everybody who hasn't looked at that highway robbery report to check it out, because there's so much really astounding and fascinating and thought-provoking data in there. And it really makes me think about, what are we going to do? What do we do about this, you know? So about the transparency with East Point. To be honest, every department has issues with transparency, even the ones that claim to be working really hard at it. So particularly Livonia and Ferndale, from the first set of graphics, they have these online dashboards, but Ferndale doesn't explain what all of their categories mean, or yeah, you can find the data, but it's sort of buried. And as a researcher or as a member of the public, you have to make your own conclusions about what it means, because they don't really give you a lot of structure to work with that data. They just put it up there and they say, look, we're being transparent. Well, that's not really, I mean, and that's the best case scenario. So in Royal Oak, as I said, they don't even list out budget expenses in the city budget. They only show me changes from last year. And in East Point, the whole city budget was uploaded as an image scan from a printout, which means that some of the pages are sort of crooked, which is how I knew that it was from a printout. And also it's not searchable, which means that it was much more time consuming to find the information I was looking for. You know, call me a skeptic, but I don't think that's an accident that these documents were put together on a computer and then they were printed out and then scanned back in order to upload them. Really? So the breakdown of the police budget, again, is really superficial. And also with East Point, the numbers didn't match up across the documents. So I was tearing my hair out about this for a while. And then I thought, you know what, I'm just going to look at the main city budget document and go from there. And if it doesn't match some of these other documents that I'm looking at, that's really East Point's problem to figure out. Like, they need to answer for why their numbers don't match up. So East Point's general fund, 49.9%, this is the biggest that I saw aside from the growth points. 49.9% of their general fund is going to the police, which is just astronomical. This is maybe Sterling Heights in 15 years will be like this after they have increased 1% a year. It's a lot. And then also, similarly, over $350 per capita on police again, and it's going up. We see that they are set to increase another $2 million over the next 4 years, similar to Royal Oak. And then, oh, the graph. How do the police spend their time? Well, they are, again, spending most of it on citations, minor infractions. They issue almost 8 citations per arrest. And I also included here cases assigned because they gave me that number. So I thought I might as well. But this is all they gave me. So I don't really know what the results of these cases were, how many. It sort of looks like from this data that, oh, there's this amount of cases assigned and about the same number of arrests, which means that they're arresting all the people who commit the crimes, right? No, that's not what that means. So the arrests, many of the arrests are, again, this is a situation where I don't have it for East Point, but I do have it for Dearborn. where you can see the breakdown of how many arrests are because of calls that are made versus how many are out, like when police are out on patrol. And you can see that the arrests are not actually matching up to the cases. The arrest rate for cases that are reported is much lower, but then they're also arresting all these people off of the street for God knows what, minor infractions. I would love to know exactly what for, East Point PD. But something that we do have, back to the city budget, is that they are spending the same amount on police as they spend on a whole bunch of departments combined, including the fire department, sanitation, court, libraries, community development, and their parks. And it's interesting to me that the fire and sanitation are included here, because in a lot of other cities, those are too big, and I would have to take them out and only talk about like other kinds of city services just for comparison. But here, that's not the case, because East Point spends so much more of its money on police than anything else that I can literally put in almost anything and it will still be less.
Wow.
So here, really, because I didn't have an arrests breakdown, I couldn't talk about that. But what I could talk about was what we could do instead with this money. And this was inspired in part by the DPD graphic that DJC did last year. But I just did some math and I looked at, $11.6 million is a lot of dollars, and we could do other stuff with that. And I wanted to give some examples, not that this is necessarily how, I'm not telling East Point how they should spend their money. I think that communities really have their own priorities, and those priorities should be listened to. But some of the options are, we could create over 200 full-time jobs that are $25 an hour. That's a good living wage in East Point, and we could employ a lot of people instead of the police, a lot more than the police department. I think they have, I want to say they have about 30 police officers. And we could house more than 100 families in $90,000 homes. So for this, I looked up the average home prices in various places. And of course, it's changing all the time. And the average is not necessarily, of course, what somebody's actually going to pay. But if we took a $90,000 home, we could house 128 families. And houselessness is a big problem in the Detroit area, and it's a problem that is often addressed with small community outreach groups, which are great. I'm not saying they're not great, but we need a bigger solution. We need to house people, and we have the means and the resources to do it, but we're putting it into other stuff instead. We could also give 11,000 families a $1,000 child tax credit. And remember, the population of East Point is about 30,000. So this is a really significant chunk of money for people who live in East Point, instead of paying for the police to criminalize Black Detroiters. And we could open a new mental wellness center. There's a lot of different ways to calculate how much it costs to build something like this. And part of it depends on what you want in there. If you want a psychiatric treatment facility, an inpatient facility, of course, it's going to be a lot more expensive. But if you're talking about like a resource center, a place where people can come for counseling, a place where people can connect, a community space, and you could have a lot of other things in a resource center, in a wellness center like that. You could do that for this amount of money.
Definitely. So now we have the city of Inkster that has a population of 24,284 with a total police budget of $4.66 million.
All right, so Inkster does list out in its city budget more line items than, say, East Point, but there's no real presentation or discussion of what any of this means. What I found was just a document it was just a spreadsheet, no information at all. Luckily, by this point, I have been looking at city budgets for a long time now. And so I was able to read it and figure out what it meant. But I'm a researcher. This is my job. You know, if I'm a resident of Inkster and I'm trying to look through this stuff and I haven't necessarily been trained, I might not know what I'm looking at. And some things are pretty self-explanatory, but a lot of it's really opaque and, you know, happens behind closed doors in city council meetings. I did think that during the pandemic, while a lot of city council meetings have been on Zoom, that's been really great for accessibility and for getting residents involved in local politics, which I think is awesome. And of course, we see already a push to return to in-person, to return to those closed doors, because it was pretty inconvenient for Dearborn City Council when members of the public showed up and demanded answers. Anyway, all right, so Inkster has the smallest budget in our sample, but it's still dominating the city budget. The police are still getting almost $4.5 million, which is way more than any of the other departments are getting. They do also spend less per capita. They spend $174 per person in 2021, and at 30.4% of the general fund, it is less. That's true. And then I just included, because I had the information and I had it for other cities too, they spent about $500,000 on overtime and holiday pay in 2022, which again is less than other places, but they also have a much smaller police force. So I'm not sure that it's as much less as it looks like. And then, so this is the part where I had nothing. What are they doing with the money? We don't know, because Inkster has no citation or arrest data. I clicked every single link on Inkster PD's website, and I could not find anywhere where they were telling me how they were actually spending, how police were spending their time. Here too, the numbers didn't quite match up. They have this separate personnel cost document that I didn't end up using because it didn't match the budget, but they listed almost $80,000 more in overtime, which in a budget of this size is huge. It's a huge difference, but I ended up having to just not include it because I couldn't find any way to back up that those numbers might be more accurate than the ones in the city budget. So big discrepancies, big lack of transparency. I went with the data that I had, and I think that Inkster has to really deal with some of that stuff. But so in terms of what we do know about the ways that policing happens in these communities, right? Half of criminal prosecutions in Michigan are for minor traffic offenses. A lot of these are about criminalizing poverty, driving with a suspended license, having a brake light out, and they're not really about public safety. And we have seen that there's no correlation between the number of police officers and crime rates, and that when police are trying to do this like proactive policing of minor offenses or community policing, or sometimes they'll call it broken windows policing if they're looking at like a very specific thought in policing from the 80s to now, research is showing that it's not working. Communities get destabilized, severe crime is actually increasing. You know, nobody wants to feel like they're going out of their house and they could be punished for any little thing. You know, you walk into a white city, you walk into Ann Arbor, and there's drug use there, there's jaywalking there, but they don't get tickets for it. So what else could this money go toward? I ended up doing a very similar thing to what I did in the last infographic, because again, I didn't have the data. So I did some numbers instead, love numbers, and you can create almost 100 full-time jobs. Again, $25 an hour, a real living wage. You can house 66 families, which maybe it doesn't sound like a lot, but in a community of this size, it's not nothing. You can provide a child tax credit to almost 4,500 families, and you could open a new community resource center. And if you actually eliminated the police department, you would have that money every year. You could do one of those things every year. And just like imagine how much our communities could thrive if we put the kind of resources that we put into policing directly into the hands of the people who live there.
Absolutely. So now we're going to do just a bit of a comparison regarding policing all across Metro Detroit.
So the first two graphs are just sheer numbers, looking at how much of each city's general fund goes to the police. I've talked about this for the individual cities, but I think it's really important to bring it together and like, what is average? What is typical here? And the answer is 37%, which is more than a third. It's more than Detroit spends, is the average for these suburbs, 37%. And then for per capita spending, how much per resident of the city, on average, they're spending $347 per resident. In the next section, I'm hearkening back to the first three infographics. So not every city gives me a breakdown of the arrest data by race, but the three that do, the Dearborn, Livonia, and Ferndale, all of these are cities with a Black population between 4 and 6%. All of them have like a little segregationist past. They're formerly known as sundown towns. They really don't like it when you bring that up. But let's look at what's happening now. Black people are making up 60% of their arrests, which is 10 times more than how many Black people live there. So maybe we should still be talking about this. Yeah, and then I said, when it comes to policing, Southeast Michigan has a racial bias problem, that is what the data shows me. I wish I had more complete data, but with the data I have, that's what it says. And it's not just race. We know that the police are really threats to people who have serious mental illness, people with disabilities. 1 in 4 people killed by the police have a serious mental illness. 1 in 2 have a disability. And then the next set of numbers is from the Vera Institute's report on behavioral health crisis alternatives. And they say that 37% of people in prison and 44% of people in jail have not just a mental illness, but an actual diagnosis on record saying this is a struggle that this person has. And yet we're putting them in jail and we're putting them in prison. And so this really brings up a lot of questions. It raises the question of what do we do about this? How can do we think that it's a good thing to put people with serious mental illnesses, with disabilities, into prison to punish them? Is this solving anything? Is this making us safer? So this time I just gave some suggestions for ways that we could invest our money. And I'm using the we as in we the people here, all of us, our communities. What alternatives would make these communities, our communities, safer? The first one comes from the Highway Robbery Report, Stop Profit-Seeking Traffic Enforcement Practices. This we have seen over and over. This is racist. This is extracting money out of Black Detroiters and funneling it into the budgets of predominantly white suburbs. And it's making people feel unsafe. It's making people unsafe. I shouldn't say feel, it is unsafe. You know, even I have, when I drive, it's an older car. I'm obviously a white driver, but it's an older car, it's an out-of-state plate. I worry about being targeted too. Because there's these practices that are criminalizing poverty, and they are also criminalizing Blackness, and they're criminalizing all kinds of like undesirable behavior. They're trying to keep people out of their suburbs. And I think this is a real problem. Next thing we could do, create robust services for returning citizens in Wayne County. So I don't have exact numbers on this. I think it's a third or more perhaps of people in the Michigan prison system, the MDOC, returned to Wayne County. Tons and tons of the overall prison population in Michigan is from Detroit and the suburbs. And so what are we doing for these people? 95% of people who go to prison come out of prison, and they're returning to Wayne County, and they don't have any documents, and they don't have a job, and they don't have so many, and they're barred from a lot of jobs and from a lot of housing opportunities, and we've just abandoned them. We haven't given them any structural support, any services. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we could be really thinking about, we could be implementing with the money that we might, for example, divert from some of these suburban police departments. Next thing, increasing resources and access to mental health services. So it's been a big topic of conversation in the last 5-10 years, longer probably, about resources for mental health services. And we know that mental health treatment is significantly underfunded, and that there's a lot of systemic issues with that, but there's also issues with access, that even if the services exist, people don't know how to get them. Maybe there's a problem with insurance. Maybe there's a problem with people just don't know that they exist. Maybe there's a problem with you need to meet certain criteria in order to be allowed to access these services. And all of these are just serving to make it harder for the people who need them to get them, which is unsafe for our community. I love that. I've seen it going around since last year, the quote that the safest communities don't have the most cops, they have the most resources. And that's so true. I heard AOC say that, and I don't know if it originated with her or not, but it's so true. I see that in so many of these communities, that consistently there's no relationship between community safety and how many police officers there are, but there's a huge relationship between the community safety and what we're giving to the people who live there, what we're providing for them, what kind of supports are in place in that city. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring up is that, Washtenaw County has just decided to end cash bail. And we could do that too in Wayne County. Wouldn't that be great? And somehow we see this over and over with all kinds of alternatives to incarceration, with all kinds of progressive strategies, and like ending cash bail. We'll try it out in these wealthier, whiter places. But then when it comes to talking about doing the same thing that's working in Wayne County or in Detroit, they're like, oh no, we can't do that. We can't have that here. Well, why not? Why not?